Well, everyone in Canada has heard about the Freedom Convoy. It was a huge story earlier this year. And Andrew Lawton has actually written a book about the inside stories with some information that people may not have picked up on. So thanks, Andrew, for taking a few minutes to chat with us about your new book.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for, I enjoy the role reversal, having had you on my shows over the years a number of times. It's good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have revenge. I got about 3,000 very difficult questions to ask you.
No, I take it back. We're going to do this again on my terms on my show.
It's too late. The first point I want to make before we jump into discussing your book is that we're going to have an extra copy for a giveaway. We're going to do a prize draw. So I'll tell everyone in a moment how they can try and win a chance to get a copy of your book. But let's start off with the basics. Why is it that you decided to write the book?
So I covered the Freedom Convoy on the ground at the very beginning in Ottawa, and also the end of it, the last few days, what ended up being the end of it, when the Emergencies Act came in play. The federal government had authorized police to move in. They did this. They dismantled the whole thing. And a lot of this stuff was covered, but in a very superficial way. And I found in my time covering it on the ground and even remotely interviewing organizers, there were a bunch of layers to this story that I didn't feel people were seeing about how the whole thing came to be, about how it was organized, about the different levels in this hierarchy, the money, all of this. And I found that the things that were covered were oftentimes not covered accurately, and much of it just wasn't covered at all. And at the end of it, I had been complaining to a friend, I'd want to read a book about this. I really want someone to write a book so I can read it. And he had sort of just told me to shut up and write it myself. So I did. And I think I'm glad, because I had access, I had knowledge, I had been on the ground, and it was just a matter of getting that all together and putting it in a narrative that people can follow regardless of how familiar or unfamiliar they are with the story.
So what would be a couple of those examples of things that maybe people would see in the news, but they kind of almost contradicted, or they were different from what you observed walking the streets, talking to lots of people on the ground during the Freedom Convoy?
I think the biggest one would just be the general mood. And by that, I mean what these people were, the protesters, what they were all about. I think one of the biggest errors that was made in coverage is branding this whole thing as an anti-vaccine protest. There were a lot of people there that were unvaccinated, but didn't really care if anyone else was. They were simply against vaccine mandates. And the anti-vaccine mandate distinction is quite a significant one, because even some of the organizers were themselves fully vaccinated. But also, I think the motivations of them in engaging in this protest. We heard all sorts of conspiracy theories in the media about how it was about overthrowing the government, and it was staging a coup, and it was all of that. But you talk to the organizers, the people that were there, the people that were the ones giving, I don't want to say they're marching orders, but certainly the ones leading the protest. And they say, no, we know that change comes through the democratic political process. We want policy change. We aren't seeking any change in the institutions of government. And a lot of them had, I think, a very reasonable goal, which is that they wanted the vaccine mandates and the vaccine passports gone. And that purpose, I think, got muddled in a lot of the coverage.
It was a huge protest. I think one of the biggest ones in Canadian history, certainly recent Canadian history. And you had a book excerpt in the National Post. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was that this thing was so big that there seemed to almost be factions that were trying to speak to the media as spokespeople. Now, just some of this, it just doesn't seem to fully add up. Like, I remember what you were just talking about there with the demands on government. It almost seemed like people were trying to plan some kind of a coup. I can't remember which journalist, but some journalists talking about this on Twitter, and I looked at it, and it seems kind of crazy that these people are trying to take over the government. But what you're saying is that the actual organizers of the convoy, that wasn't part of their agenda at all. Is that correct?
Correct. And I will say, I mean, there were a couple of people That, well, I'll even take it a step back and say that one of the big challenges of a grassroots movement is that there was no CEO that was appointing people to different positions. There were people that emerged as leaders, but when I say emerged, anyone who showed up and did something really became a part of this. And a lot of these people didn't know each other. They all show up, they want to be friendly. And sometimes you find out, oh, this person's a little bit nutty, or oh, this person's a bit kooky. And then other organizers would come together and say, okay, we don't think this person should be involved. We don't think this person should be talking to media. And that was the inevitable byproduct, I think, of people just coming from all over the country who wanted to be a part of this. And I think that was one of the big, in a lot of ways, contradictions, at least on some level, that you had these organizers, you had the people that established this corporate board, the people that were raising millions of dollars on GoFundMe and later Give, Send, Go, the people that were doing press conferences in hotels. And then you had the people that just showed up, that didn't care what a Tamara Leach was or a Benjamin Dichter or a Chris Barber, the people that just showed up because they were a trucker or a sympathizer and they were against vaccine mandates. And one of the things that was so interesting about it is that as much as of an organization as there was, certainly by the end of it, they couldn't really and weren't really wanting to command anyone. All they could do is talk and persuade, but the organizers weren't actually generals of an army in any way. The people were going to do what the people were going to do.
You know, when I see this type of thing unfold, I often think about statistics, right? Just sort of the law of numbers. Whenever you gather large numbers of people, especially in the thousands, you're bound to find some people that are a bit nutty and, you know, sort of at the extreme. We saw that with this convoy right in the early stages, where someone had, I think it was a Confederate flag, someone else had like a Nazi flag, and I think that caused a lot of people to bristle. I mean, I certainly did. But what was the reaction sort of from the I'll say the real organizers? What was their take on that type of thing?
Before it even got to the quote unquote organizers, I should point out about the Confederate flag incident in the first place. This took place on the very first Saturday of the convoy, so the day the trucks officially arrived in Ottawa. And there was this photo of a masked figure, I think wearing sunglasses and a balaclava, holding a Confederate flag in the crowd on the front hill of Parliament. And the picture went viral. A lot of people, certainly in a Canadian context, say that that flag has no place here. There was a video of that same guy that went less viral, which was interesting because in that video, you see all the people in the crowd telling the person to get lost, telling him to scram, heckling him and jeering him, and ultimately forcing him out. Now, again, his face was fully covered. Was he a Confederate sympathizer? Was he simply an instigator? Doesn't matter. The point is the people at the protest wanted nothing to do with him. And the same was true of the guy in the swastika, the guy with the swastika flag that we saw, not in the midst of the crowd, but I think it was near like the Chateau Laurier or something, those photos. So a little bit set apart. And what was interesting with that, again, the organizers very quick to denounce it. This person has still never been identified. So there has been speculation about whether this was a person who was a Nazi sympathizer who supported the convoy. Were they someone who wanted to make some really ham-fisted point using an offensive symbol like calling the government Nazis? Or was it someone who wanted to bring disrepute onto the convoy, and knowing that a good way to do that would be to walk around waving a swastika flag? All of those are plausible, but I'd say that in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter because you had the organizers and everyone I spoke to denouncing hate, denouncing those symbols, and really calling for a peaceful, loving protest. That was what Tamara Leach said time and time again. We're here for peace, we're here for love. And anyone that wasn't there for those purposes really didn't have a place.
You know, that was the overall vibe that I picked up from social media when I would see all these different clips online of different journalists that would be walking around posting them. Rupa Subramanya, you talked about her in one of your National Post excerpts. I mean, she was one where it seemed like she was just going up to everyday people, and it seemed like they were normal people, just people that were fed up. They didn't like what the government was doing. They were trying to, I would say, peacefully protest what was happening. Now, we're a public policy think tank. We're always interested in the public policy angle to different issues. I'm curious about your take on how this could have potentially been handled differently, because it did seem to be like not like it was a big problem for the government, right? They had all these trucks blocking streets in Ottawa. There were concerns about noise, and there were also issues with border crossings too. So if let's say the prime minister at one point, as this was getting going, said, you know what, I'm done, I'm out. Andrew Lawton, I want you to be prime minister here. You've got to deal with this. But what do you think maybe could have been done differently?
So under the scenario, Justin Trudeau has handed the reins over to me, which may end up being his most controversial decision yet. I think. You know, the challenge is, I have to really go against your premise for a moment there, because I think that finding a solution at that point was always going to be very difficult, when I think the most viable solution, and certainly the least disruptive, would have come weeks before the trucks got to Ottawa, at the very least days before, when their grievance was a pretty reasonable one to most people. These are the truckers who have been the essential workers, the heroes keeping us going and keeping our grocery store shelves stocked for the last 2 years during COVID. Pandemic is on its way out around the world. Countries are reopening, dropping mandates. And Trudeau says in December of 2021, we're going to put a vaccine mandate for cross-border truckers. If you're an American trucker, you can't come to Canada. If you're a Canadian trucker, you have to quarantine every time you come back, which basically means you're not able to do your job, which involves going back and forth almost daily. So this thing, which targeted people that work and in some cases live in their trucks in relative isolation, did not have a scientific basis whatsoever. And when truckers get together and say, you know, we're kind of bothered by this, I think the government would at least be suited to hear them out, to have a conversation. And even as the protest really ballooned beyond that really quickly to be about vaccine mandates and COVID restrictions in general, the government did not one thing that suggested they were even interested in hearing these people, let alone making any policy concessions. And you may say, well, what would be the point if the government wasn't prepared to make any changes? I'd say it would be significant, because what the Trudeau government did was the opposite of conciliation. They went to dehumanization. Trudeau's comment about how this is a fringe minority with unacceptable views, calling unvaccinated protesters racist, misogynistic. I mean, how being not vaccinated has anything to do with misogyny, I'm still trying to figure out. But those became the primary grievances. I mean, yeah, undergirding those things were opposition to vaccine mandates and vaccine passports. But when the protesters got to Ottawa, if you talk to them, the biggest thing that bothered them was their treatment by Justin Trudeau in the days immediately prior and continuing through the course of it. So I think that the government needed to, first off, recognize that these are people with their own challenges who the government has called heroes for the last 2 years before it gets to that point of being this 3-week-long protest that no one knows what to do about.
Yeah, and you know what, I would actually agree with what you just said. I mean, it didn't make sense to me that they were bringing in these restrictions on truck drivers. Especially not just the fact that, as you pointed out, these people were considered to be heroes for delivering the goods and services that we all needed throughout the pandemic, but you know, just also the science behind it, right? There was no science, I think, to justify saying to all these people, you have to now be vaccinated, especially when you consider the type of work. I mean, these are mostly men in trucks alone throughout the day. And quite often they sleep in their trucks. They have very little interaction with other people. And if the odd one did pick up the virus while they were in the United States, by that point, the virus was already in Canada and it was already rapidly spreading. So it would have had a negligible impact. And when you consider too that that industry was struggling at the time, I believe they were short on truck parts, having trouble keeping trucks on the road because it was in the winter, and you know, and they crash and some of them need repairs. Supply chain problems were all over the place. It was tough to get parts to fix trucks and that. So you're going to exacerbate the problem by taking some of the men and women who actually are able-bodied and want to do the work, and you're going to say, well, you can't do it because you're vaccinated. I don't think that made a lot of sense to me. And I wasn't opposed to having some restrictions on personal freedoms. It was a pandemic, but that one, I don't think it added up. I feel though, at the same time, I think that, personally, I think it's important for people to be able to protest. Where I had a problem with it was when you started to see the border obstructed and trucks parked in the streets for days on end. I feel like the government poorly handled that. They knew that this convoy was coming for days. Like you said, maybe they could have had some conversations ahead of time, nip it in the bud, at the very least put up some blockades so that you don't end up with gridlock in the downtown part of Ottawa there. But one of the things I thought was interesting that you had mentioned earlier when we were talking was that the people who were doing the border blockades, those are separate from the people that were actually ordering or organizing the Freedom Convoy. Is that right?
Yes, this was one of the really interesting things is that nowhere in the Ottawa hierarchy, for lack of a better term, was there anyone that I've been able to identify who was stage managing or choreographing what was happening at the borders. The border protests were, insofar as I'm able to tell, and the people I've spoken to, entirely organic, certainly inspired by the Ottawa convoy protest and connected in the sense of the timing was not just coincidental, but they weren't being run out of Ottawa. So, if police were able to say in negotiations, well, we'll give you this if you clear up Windsor or something like that, they literally could not do that if they wanted to, because the people there just showed up on their own. And that was what made it so difficult for police to go after them, is that these things really just did arise in an organic way. And I would add to that, too, that if we talk about the Emergencies Act in any detail in this country, which we're doing through this inquiry, we hope, the thing that I would point out is that the Emergencies Act was coming as the border blockades were already on their way out. Most of them had been dismantled. I think there were one or two remaining by the time Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, but they were going to be cleared in the next day before the powers even went into effect. So even if people hold those up as being the most disruptive, because they were international by definition, even then, law enforcement using regular law enforcement powers were able to deal with those.
Yeah, and that I've heard that too, and I think that's interesting, especially now that you hear all these law enforcement divisions saying, "Well, we didn't call for it." It's like, well, why was it implemented then if it wasn't needed? I think the fallout's going to be really interesting over the next probably a couple of years as governments continue to analyze what happened, just sort of how you deal with a protest like this. And as I mentioned, I fully support people's right to protest, but I think that stops when you start to obstruct other people's mobility. And I don't think governments handle that well enough to be able to move the trucks in downtown Ottawa and get people moving around, and while still respecting the protesters' right to protest. Is there anything that maybe we've missed that you'd like to let potential readers know about?
I mean, there's lots that we missed, but I don't think we have time to go to every detail. And I also don't want to give people an excuse to not have to buy the book and figure it out for themselves. The one thing I would say is that while I'm very sympathetic to the reasons behind the protests, and I'm sympathetic to the protests themselves, the book is written in a way that I'm very proud of as an exercise in journalism. And I'm sympathetic, but not sycophantic. That's the line I've shared with people before. So even if folks aren't on board with the convoy, they aren't rah for it, I still think there's a lot to learn about how this whole thing came to be and about understanding the motivations of the protesters in the book. So I would just tell people that this isn't a hagiography of the convoy. Really, it's, I think, an exercise in trying to trace this back to its origin and tell a side of the story that really didn't manifest in media coverage. That's what I was going for anyway.
Well, I'm eager to get a copy of your book in the mail. Like I said, I've ordered it. It's on its way. I'm looking forward to reading it, because it really was a fascinating protest movement to see come on the scenes in Canada. It was absolutely huge. And you and I had chatted about this before too, how it was impactful beyond Canada's borders. Lots of people were watching this, and there were copycat movements and that. So it'll be interesting to read some of the anecdotes and stories that you have that maybe didn't get as much attention publicly. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned that we are going to have a copy of your book as a raffle. So if people are interested in winning it, send me an email, colin@secondstreet.org. That's COLIN at SECONDSTREET.org. And I'll do a draw next week, and one lucky winner will get a copy of your book in the mail. So the most important question I have to ask you before we wrap up here, and that is, where can people get a copy of your book if they'd like to order one?
Well, if you are one of the unlucky ones that doesn't win a Colin's raffle, you can pick up the Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world, on Amazon, on Indigo, from the publisher directly. That's SutherlandHouseBooks.com, or hopefully in your local neighborhood bookstore.
Well, that's great. And congrats again, Andrew, on writing your book. And like I said, look forward to reading it.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Take care.